Hello everybody, how are you this evening? Good. Welcome to the Commission's community conversation. The aim of the evening, which I'm sure you're aware of, is to begin a conversation. So the Commission is here to listen as well as to share some of their knowledge and experiences. I guess we're going to hear about the science, what it means, what to do about it, and how it relates to you. We'll hear from what the Commissioners have been doing in Mackay and what they've seen, and there will be an opportunity to ask some questions as well. To get started, I'd like to introduce Professor Tim Flannery, the Chief Climate Commissioner. You probably recognise Professor Flannery. He's one of Australia's leading writers on climate change, an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist. Professor Flannery was named Australian of the Year in 2007. He's held various academic positions, including Professor at the University of Adelaide, Director at the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, Principal Research Scientist at the Australian Museum, and Visiting Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University in the Department of and Evolutionary Biology. And he's also doing a TV show, so this man can do anything. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Tim Flannery.
Thanks very much, Gillian, and thank you all for being here this evening. I think it's a pretty special opportunity to speak to people such as our climate commissioners here. I think what I'd like to do to begin is just outline a little bit about who the Climate Commission is, the work we're supposed to do, then introduce you a bit more to our commissioners and tell you about what we've been doing today in Mackay. The Climate Commission was established as a result of an election promise by the Gillard government at the last election. It's an independent commission, which means that we don't take direction from the minister, so we're independent in the sense that we are, although we're funded by government, we don't take direction from government on things. And we're charged with really doing three things. We're to lead a discussion on climate science, and what the scientists are telling us is happening to our climate. Secondly, to have a dialogue about the state of international negotiations and what's happening in other countries, because Australia is obviously not facing this challenge alone. And thirdly, to lead a discussion about the options, the economic options that are available for a country like Australia as it goes forward in this carbon-constrained world. We're not here to comment on policy, government or opposition, so we're not going to give you our view on a carbon tax or anything else, but we can lead a discussion around the various options that are available to us. Today we've spent meeting with community leaders and looking at some of your industries here in Mackay. We went out to the Racecourse Sugar refinery earlier on today, which was a very, very interesting experience for us. We had a look at the plant there, which is being built, that in a couple of years' time will be providing a third of Mackay's electricity from renewable sources, which I was really surprised at. That, as a community, that puts you in the lead, really, in terms of developing renewable energy sources, and I think will give you in future a very profitable new industry in this part of the world. So that was very encouraging for us. We met after that with a number of leaders. We met with your mayor, with business leaders from the mining industry and mining-related industry, from the sugar industry, and from local council, and had a broad-ranging discussion on the issues that I mentioned the Commission's charged with discussing. So that was, I think, a very, very cordial and very good meeting for us. We learnt a lot. We hope that the people we met with learnt something as well. So we're very pleased to be here this evening, having had that insight into the community here and the sort of challenges you face. I just want to talk briefly about our climate commissioners here, because we have got some very, very special people who I think can give you the benefit of their very long and extensive engagement with climate issues. Roger Beale over here is an economist working with PwC, but among the many things he's done was help negotiate the Kyoto Protocol. He currently advises Premier Hu Jintao of China on clean energy and environmental policy. So he's got an excellent overview of not just economic matters, but the overall negotiations, international negotiations. He also knows more than anyone that I know about every individual business around Australia. He seems to have visited every factory in the country. So he's pretty full bottle on all of that as well. Leslie Hughes, Professor Leslie Hughes from Macquarie University, who's a climate scientist with expertise in climate adaptation and the impacts of changing climate on biodiversity. And Leslie will give a presentation at the beginning here just to outline what we know about climate science and where we're going. And Jerry Houston, who's the ex-CEO of BP Australasia. So from a business perspective and someone who's dealt with the practicalities of the climate challenge in a carbon-intensive industry, he's got a lot of very important things, I think, to say. So, so with that, I think I will sit down and hand over back to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I will invite Leslie to come up, and she's going to she's giving a short presentation. So there's a couple of slides, and it's not a lecture. It's just a basic level of information to help us all get an idea of where we're going tonight. Professor Leslie Hughes is an expert on the impacts of climate change on species, ecosystems, and she's the head of Department of the Biological Sciences at Macquarie University.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming tonight, and thank you, Gillian. Yes, what I want to do is just sort of set the context of the Q&A that's going to follow, to just show you a few pictures about what's been happening with the climate. I also want to bring it down to a personal level and down to a Mackay specific level, and talk a little bit about what we think some of the impacts of climate change might be for your area here. So let's begin. Put at its most simply, the greenhouse effect, the greenhouse gases are like a blanket wrapped around the Earth. And when solar radiation comes in from the sun, it bounces off the Earth's surface, some of it's absorbed, the rest is reflected back out. And then some of that reflection bounces backwards and forwards under that blanket and through that blanket of greenhouse gases. If we didn't have greenhouse gases, the Earth would be an extremely inhospitable place. We wouldn't be here. It would be about minus 18 degrees. So the greenhouse gases make the Earth about 33 degrees more warm than it would otherwise be. We do need them. A lot of people say, hasn't the climate changed all the time? Isn't what we're seeing now just natural variability? Well, it is the case that climate has changed throughout geological history, and what this graph shows is the relationship, the very, very tight, close relationship with the level of CO2 in the atmosphere and the temperature of the Earth's surface. So this goes back, this graph goes back 400,000 years, and it shows several cycles, ice ages, warming and cooling, with the temperature and CO2 very, very closely aligned with each other. But something different has been happening since the Industrial Revolution, and the little red bit on the end of that graph, if I can make this laser pointer show, that bit, that's the increase in greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution. So you can see that we're now right outside that natural variable, that envelope of natural variability. We've been doing something pretty different to the Earth's atmosphere over the last couple of 100 years. And if we just look at that on a more resolved timescale, you can see this is what's been happening to CO2 in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. And you can see it's pretty much been an exponential increase over that time. And along with that, because we understand the relationship between CO2 and temperature, and in fact we've understood that relationship for at least 200 years, this is what's been happening to the temperature in the lower atmosphere going back to 1880. And you can see that it zigzags around from year to year. It's not a smooth curve, but the basic trajectory is upwards. Now, some of you will have heard that 1998 was a particularly warm year, and indeed you can see that on this graph. It's that point there. But since that time, here we are now. 2009, 2010. In fact, the 12 very warmest years ever recorded were June 2009 to May 2010. The 12 12 warmest months ever recorded. So that's where we are now. So now we're talking about the future, and I want to present you with two different possible futures. One future, a more optimistic future, is shown in those blue lines at the bottom of the bottom graph of temperature. Here we are here. We've got two choices here. Here's the choice that we have to really strongly abate greenhouse gases, really reduce emissions, and if we do that, we might be able to keep future temperature rises to 2 degrees or less. If we don't, if we carry on business as usual, we're looking at the red part of that graph up here. Very broad range. We're not very certain about how hot it will be, but we know it will be a lot hotter. Now, I know some people find it a bit difficult to relate to these sorts of graphs because you think, well, you know, that's a long way in the future, you know, it's not going to affect me. So I want to actually make this a bit personal, if you will forgive my indulgence here. Okay. I was born in the early 1960s, and assuming, hopefully, that I'll live till I'm about 85, I've put my lifespan in there, and I've lined it up with the average temperature increase that I will experience over my lifespan. So it's there. I've got two teenage kids born in the 90s, mid-90s, so assuming they live till they're about 85, I've put their lifespan in there, also lined up along the average temperature at which they will experience over that time. And I don't have grandchildren yet, but if I do have a couple of grandkids, and let's assuming my kids have them when they're about 30 and they live till they're about 85, that's their lifespan. So what I want to just point out to you that, for example, in my grandkids' lifespan, if they live beyond the year 2100, this is the potential range of temperatures that they might experience. So I just wanted to do that to kind of bring it home to you that this is about us, it's about our children, and it's about our grandchildren. They will be affected. Okay, well, let's talk about Mackay. Over the past decade, the average annual temperature in Mackay has increased about 0.3 of a degree. So your average annual temperature used to be 22.7 and it's now 23 degrees. By 2070, global climate models indicate that temperatures might increase a further 1.6 to 3 degrees, depending on the scenario that's used. The number of days above 35 is currently 1 a year. That might increase, according to the models, to about 12 a year by 2070. And if we think about rainfall, the average rainfall in this region's declined about 14% over that past decade. Projecting rainfall in the future is really hard, but the best estimate is for potentially an ongoing decline by 2070, maybe about another 5 to 10% decline. Sea levels have been going up in Queensland, North Queensland, about 3.3 millimetres a year, and that's around about the global average. Last year, the government released an impacts report on looking at coastal vulnerability of coastal infrastructure all around Australia. Mackay came out as the second most vulnerable region in Queensland when you look at the potential for residential buildings to be inundated by a sea level rise of about 1 metre. So second highest risk. We're looking at potentially much more extreme events, both in frequency and in intensity. So while we can't attribute any particular extreme event like this flood back in February 2008 to climate change, what we're looking at is potentially an increase in the frequency and intensity. And in tropical cyclones, the models are indicating that there may only be a small increase in frequency, but potentially quite a substantial increase in the intensity of cyclones, with by 2070 about 140% increased probability of category 3 to 5 cyclones. And I'm sure that some of you have lived through those sorts of fairly scary events. The Great Barrier Reef, which Queensland relies on for a lot of its tourism income is actually subject to really 4 different threats: bleaching from high temperatures, acidification. The water is more acid in this ocean than it has been for the last 420,000 years. It's become 30% more acid since the Industrial Revolution. Sea level rise and cyclone damage, of course, also affects the Great Barrier Reef. And in 2008, Access Economics estimated that the Great Barrier Reef was worth about $6 billion to the Australian economy, and of course most of that money comes into the central and northern Queensland area, and was worth 70,000 jobs. And then finally I wanted to say something about the sugar industry, because that's obviously very important in this local region. It is vulnerable to rainfall decline, it is vulnerable to coastal inundation because much of the cane is grown in low-lying areas, and it is prone to any increase in soil evaporation and the drying of the soil, and also cyclone damage. So the sugar industry is also facing some fairly serious risks in the future. But we will talk about adaptation later on. Okay, I'll leave it there. And hopefully, between all of us, we'll be able to answer as many of your questions as you throw at us. Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you, Leslie. Now there's an opportunity for you to ask questions of the Commission. A number of pre-registered questions have been submitted, and I'll be using some of those as well as your questions here tonight. Okay, I'll start things rolling by asking one of the pre-registered questions, which is, how does the rapid development of coal and gas fit in with our aim of reducing emissions? Will carbon pricing reverse these developments? Roger, can I put that to you?
Well, this basin has perhaps the best quality coal in the world, and it's positioned close to the most strongly growing markets. It is unavoidable for the next 25 to 30 years that coal will be an important source of energy for the world. What is critical is that we use it much more efficiently. So I think point number 1 is that there will be an ongoing demand for Australian coal. A large proportion of your coal, a huge percentage of it, is exported. And so to the extent that it's impacted by actions taken to control climate change, it will be impacted by actions taken overseas. However, as I said, every available indicator suggests increasing demand. Should we or could we simply stop Australian coal exports? Well, we could do that, but there are other countries that produce coal as well, and if this demand is unavoidable, there is the possibility that coal of lower quality will be shipped for longer distances with a bigger greenhouse signal to meet that need. So at core, the demand for the output of this industry in this region will continue. As we move further into the future, the rate of increase will no doubt diminish. Gas is going to be a strong gainer from action globally and in Australia to curb greenhouse gas emissions. It is 30 to 50% less CO2 intensive than coal. That means that China, Korea, Japan, other countries are attempting to increase the proportion of gas in their energy production. However, almost all of those countries, while they will need coal, are trying to make sure that it's burnt very efficiently, and countries like India and Japan have actually introduced coal taxes already, which they would expect to ramp up to really drive that efficiency. So there you are. Strong future prospects for the industry over the foreseeable future, but increased attention always to trying to use coal much more efficiently.
My name's Patricia Julian. I'm the coordinator for the Mackay Conservation Group. A couple of things worry me about what you've just told the public here. One is that coal, the full cost of coal, has not been properly costed to society. Things like the cost to human health, for example. There was a recent University of Harvard School of Public Health study which said the real cost of coal is about 2 to 3 times what we actually think it is. And what we'd really like to see happening in Australia through the Gillard government is that we get a full costing on coal so that we know just how competitive it really is with things like solar, thermal, baseload power.
Well, there's no comment on policy tonight, so
it's not policy.
Is there a question?
It's just the fact that information needs updating, and I'm asking how we can get that information updated.
Look, again, very quickly, there is no doubt that coal has a number of negative dimensions, both environmentally and in terms of health. The coal from this basin is probably as clean a coal as you'll get in the uses to which it is put, but efforts must be made to both include those costs wherever possible and to do what you can to restrict their impacts. But the inescapable fact is that for a period of time, coal is going to be in great demand, particularly as our region gets richer.
Okay.
Could I just point out there as well, just to say that you're quite right that there are what we call externalities to the use of coal, you know, and there are many of them, including sulphur dioxide and nitrous oxide and particulates and so forth, which have impacts on human health. And the Chinese government, among others, is very, very aware of this. They've just produced a position paper in the last year or two called The True Price of Coal, which reflects much of that. So they're aware of it, but it is very difficult to shift the energy economy quickly. But the point I just want to make is that when we look at putting a price on carbon, that really is an attempt to cost one of those externalities, which is the impacts of the greenhouse gases. And I think it's important when we come to dealing with these questions that we do cost those externalities.
Good evening, my name's Adrian McMillan. Now, I'd just like to ask something. Now, we've just seen a graph up here before with temperatures and CO2 levels. Now, I've seen other graphs that say that the CO2 lags behind the temperature and that the sun has a lot of effect on what actually happens with our CO2. Now, just one question, with that graph there, that's gone back 400,000 years. Now, what happened during the Vikings? They used to grow crops and it was all melted. So why isn't that on the graph there?
Sure. Look, you're absolutely right in the first thing that you said there, which is the CO2 lags the temperature increase initially. What has driven those changes in the past is what's called the Milankovitch cycles, which concerns the orbit of the Earth around the Sun, the wobble of the Earth on its axis, and the tilt of the Earth's axis. All of those things have an impact. And as the Ice Age ends and the Earth begins to warm, those factors, so the Milankovitch cycle, drives the initial warming, which warms the oceans. The oceans, because they're warmer, can't hold as much CO2. It's like a can of Coke, you know, when it's warm it outgasses quickly. If it's cold it tends to outgas slower. So the oceans let the CO2 into the atmosphere, that causes further warming, and then that drives the cycle. So the first little bit's the Milankovitch cycles, but then the CO2 causes a positive feedback, what we call a positive feedback, that keeps the system warming.
What about water vapour?
Water vapour is driven by CO2 concentration. So as the CO2 gets into the atmosphere, it warms the atmosphere, and that then allows the air to hold more moisture. Cold air is very dry. Warm air can hold a lot more moisture vapour. Sure. No. Look, when we get back to that period, what's called the medieval warm period, if you want, around about 1300 AD, there is good evidence that over Europe, conditions were warmer over northern Europe than they have been historically. But if you look at the temperatures globally, there's no evidence that the entire planet's warming up. It seems that there was some regional anomaly at the time. Might have involved the Gulf Stream, it might have involved some other regional climatic factors that for a certain period of time allowed Europe to be warmer than it is today. but it's not part of a global change, because if you look at the global temperatures, the signal isn't there. And I should just say, the way we get these records is the ice core data, and if I just take a second on that, I mean, that 400,000 year thing, you think, well, how would we know what's happening 400,000 years ago? Well, scientists have drilled through the ice cap in Greenland and Antarctica to reveal a year-by-year record of change, and the ice has little bubbles of air in it, so you can look in those bubbles of air to look at the CO2 concentration and so forth and get the real data. I actually went to Copenhagen, to the university where they hold these ice cores, and the bloke pulled one out about this long, and I could see the bands in it like this. It's about 2 centimetres wide, and he showed me the thing and said, look at that band there. He said, that band fell as snow over the Greenland ice cap in the year Jesus was born, which amazed me.
Yeah.
And then he said that, you know, well, those little bubbles of air, he said, statistically, it's almost certain that there's a few molecules breathed out by the Holy Family during that year in those little bubbles of air.
Wow.
But it just tells you how good that record can be. Yeah.
Now, like, you know the story about the planes up there that were dug, they had 258 feet of snow over them up when they crashed there.
So we might just move on if that's okay. There's a few people wanting questions.
But the
so-
record is quite good, and it includes tree ring data and other sorts of proxy data for temperatures. That's how we build those early
Okay,
records.
sir in the green shirt there.
My name's Jack Long, a retired farmer. I've got a couple of questions, and the first one is that does the panel think that carbon trading could be a bonanza for the world stock market? I've had about 20 years' experience playing around with shares and been reasonably successful. I just think that on some of the literature that I've read that's come out of America, it could be a bonanza for the stock market.
Okay, we'll deal with that one first. Jerry, would you like to tackle that one?
Yeah, a carbon trading scheme is clearly a way in which you can price carbon, and in fact, a large number of the businesses in Australia have actually supported as one of the best market-based mechanisms to actually drive to the lowest cost solution. To set up a system, it needs to have integrity. It needs to be supported in the long term by successive governments, and it needs to have the right regulation around it. But it also needs to work and be enduring as a commercial enterprise. So yeah, there will be money in it, but it should be an effective mechanism to actually drive to the lowest cost solution by providing an incentive for businesses to invest in a lower carbon future, and also to provide incentives for consumers to actually use less energy, basically, in their daily needs.
Okay. Yes, sir, at the front.
Good evening, everyone in the panel. Thank you very much for your presentations. My name is John Sweet. Been around the ridges here since '59. My family's been here for 6 generations before and down the track. I've been a cattleman. I've been everywhere out in the bush. And PA Yeomans from Keyline taught me to listen to the land. And at the moment, the land is screaming out for help. And it's all related to climate change. And Leslie, those things that you mentioned are very true. The acidification, the health of our future generations. And I'm wondering if anybody on the panel has looked at the health of our soil and the true health of our soil, and remineralising our soil with good quality rock dust, highly energetic paramagnetic value.
Okay.
Because that will meet a lot of the problems we have.
Okay. Would anyone like to tackle that one as Tim?
Oh, look, it's a little bit, I think, beyond the expertise of the Climate Commission. We don't. I know. Well, I know. I'm sorry. It's really hard for us to comment. We don't have a soil science expert here at all.
We've got as much expertise as we can have. We obviously can't cover everything. Thank you very much. Is there another?
I think there is a wider issue here without dealing in the specifics, and that is there is no silver bullet for solving this. And every piece of work that's been done says it's going to need a multifaceted approach. A lot of it with technologies we know today, a lot of things that we actually don't know about, and to be developed in the future. But it's going to be a broad-brushed approach. There's no silver bullet, and who knows what's going to come up in the future that's going to facilitate the change that we need.
And look, I think part of that will definitely be soil carbon protection and soil carbon capture, including forms of biochar and other sequestration of carbons which do have the effect that you're looking for in terms of fertilisation. And we actually saw some of that today in part out at the sugar mill.
That's right. Certainly the charcoal or carbon content in soils is something we can talk about. But
You can double it or treble it in 5 years if you do the right thing.
sure, and there's different means of doing that. Better grazing regimes, to that holistic management or rotational grazing for the cattle industry, I think, has been quite an important tool, along with charcoal. And,
Thank you for your question. Anybody else over here? Yes, a lady there with the checkered scarf.
We hear a lot about clean coal, carbon sequestration and all that sort of thing, but where is the actual technology at the moment? I haven't really heard of any successful carbon sequestration anywhere in the world yet. Subban.
Sorry. There has been successful carbon sequestration, particularly in the North Sea. This is re-injecting carbon CO2 into depleting oil and gas reservoirs. I have indeed seen in Europe plants which are producing zero carbon. They are at large scale, but not fully commercial. What hasn't yet successfully happened is linking that either post-combustion or pre-combustion capture of carbon with the actual sequestration. And I guess there are two critical issues. One is there is an inevitable energy penalty of, at the best of the plants at the moment, of about 25%, and there is ensuring the safety and permanency of the reservoirs. There seems to be little doubt that the technology is proving a little more expensive and technically demanding than was initially thought. But as Jerry was saying, there's no silver bullet for this. We must pursue all of these options and use the right ones in the right place.
And just following on from that, I have no doubt in my mind that carbon sequestration will be a feature in the solution. It's a question of the degree. So that there's a lot of it happening within the oil industry at the moment. There's examples of taking a gas stream, converting it to hydrogen and CO2, putting the CO2 back down an old oil well or gas well, and burning the hydrogen as fuel for a power station. You get a virtuous circle on that. So there's examples like that, and the go-ahead for the big Gorgon gas development is conditional upon CO2 being re-injected into the into the well. So it is happening, but taking it to the next major industrial step, actually capturing it from the stack, so to speak, of current power stations and putting it into a massive storage, such as a saline aquifer, where you actually put it right back into into a sea below the rock bed. That's been tested at a sort of micro scale, but it hasn't been rolled out industrially. But that is one of the technologies that's going to require more than just a carbon price. It's going to require fairly significant upfront support from the relevant governments of the day wherever it happens, and that's the sort of what I'd like to call the technology valley of death that we need to get through for some of these technologies.
Questions over here, anybody? The quiet end of the room. Yes, sir, in the front row with the checkered shirt. Thanks.
My name is Bob Baker. I'm a chemical engineer by initial training, and I was seconded to the National Coal Board in the UK in the 1970s by CSR. My specialty is fuel technology, and my belief is that talk about carbon sequestration at large scale is a convenient myth as opposed to an intermediate truth. That it's all well and good talking about using the water gas shift reaction to convert methane into hydrogen and put the CO2 back. There you're taking one volume of gas and putting one volume of gas back in the ground. when you start talking about taking a tonne of carbon and coal out of the ground, working out the volume of CO2 that you produce, working out the fact that there's 4 times as much nitrogen attached to the CO2, and having to do the separation and put it back, it's a whole different ballgame. I believe it as a very convenient myth for Australians at the moment.
Is there a question that you...
The question is, does anybody have any basis to believe that it is better than a myth?
I'd pick up the earlier point that was made. There is no silver bullet, so I don't think carbon sequestration is going to be a silver bullet that's going to solve the problem. As I said earlier, I think it will be a part of it. The question is the degree to which it will be, and you know, it's unproven at industrial scale. So at this moment, I think you're absolutely right. Whether that's the case into the future, I don't know. But you know, well, you know, who knows what the future is going to hold? But there's a tremendous amount of resource being put into you know, trying to find ways to make it work. And I think it's a question of the degree to which it's used. And you know, but it's never going to be a silver bullet. It's, you know, even if it does partly work, there's still a lot of other solutions that are going to be needed to throw at it. Absolutely.
Okay, I've just got another pre-registered question here, if you wouldn't mind. Maybe Tim, this one could be for you. Why is the government looking at greenhouse gas reduction targets far below and far slower than what the science is telling us is required, when positive, practical and effective means for action are available to us right now, given the political will?
Yeah, sure. Look, it's important to understand the target in the context of global ambitions to reduce CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions overall. The Copenhagen meeting in December 2009 came to an agreement which is called the Copenhagen Accord, and under that accord, various nations around the world have pledged a certain percentage of emissions reduction. And under the accord, about the pledges add up to about 2/3 of the emissions reductions required to avoid dangerous climate change, which is really more than 2 degrees of warming. Australia's contribution to that is a -5% reduction below 2000 levels, which sounds quite small, but it's actually quite an ambitious target, because we've got a growing economy and a growing population, and if no action was taken, we would be 26% above 2000 levels by 2020. So if you add that to the 5%, it's a big cut, nearly 30% reduction. And we've got to achieve that in 8 years and 7 months, the time ticking away. Last month I was saying 8 years and 8 months. So it's a very, very ambitious target with a short time period, but it is commensurate with our fair bit of the deal. Now, in terms of where we get the other third of emissions reductions from, Lord Stern's done some work on that and has suggested that if Europe increases its ambitions by a bit, from 20% to 30%, that'll get us a bit more along the way. And we've seen that possibility open up with Britain now committing to, just in the last few days, a more ambitious target than they previously had. The US needs to increase its ambition. Its ambition is -17% by 2020. And for those of you who think that nothing's happening in the US, I was there two or three weeks ago. I met with Obama's chief climate advisor, who told me that they're already well on track to make that target. They're at -9% already. And with their new automobile standards and so forth, and with the emissions trading scheme starting in California at the end of the year, they're confident they'll get there. The same is true for Canada. It's got a -17% target. It's on track through the work of the provinces to get there as well. So there's a lot happening in that space, and I think Australia's target, although yes, it'd be lovely to solve the problem overnight, it's ambitious and it's appropriate in terms of the global action.
Can I just say, what about China in that point? China gets brought up a lot.
Yeah.
Roger?
It's worth a couple of things to say about China. First of all, at every level in government, it is taking this very seriously. It sees climate change as a real threat. It, however, recognises its people legitimately aspire to higher standards of living. So the answer for the Chinese has been to drive intensity, the emissions intensity of the economy down. If they succeed in achieving the goals of the 12th five-year plan, building on the 11th and the 10th, the rate of decrease in emissions intensity will be historically unprecedented. on the whole, they have a record of actually achieving their 5-year plan goals, if sometimes in a very crude and clumsy way, like switching off a province for a month or two, browning things out. They're looking for better ways of doing it. One of those is that they're actually exploring the ideas of carbon taxes or emissions trading, and they're pioneering that first in the SO2 market, but we can expect them to begin to move into these other markets. Their per capita emissions, of course, are a tiny fraction of ours, and by 2030 they would say that they might be considering actually then attempting to turn their emissions south. So they expect us to give them the headroom and the lead, and then they will follow on, and then another decade or so later, the lesser developed countries. So if we can get that pattern going globally, then we can meet that 2 degree, or if we don't quite meet it, not overshoot by too much.
Okay, is there another question?
My name's Dave Westman. I've got a question relating to the chart that was up there earlier. When we're looking at a year or two ago being the warmest on record, was there a period when the Earth was warmer, and if so, or even back when it was increasing and decreasing in temperature, what caused the increase and the decrease in that period?
Sure. Look, if you go back several million years, 4 or 5 million years, you find a world where temperatures were higher and greenhouse gas concentrations were higher. But that was a very different world. It was a world where the continents were slightly differently configured. So the Isthmus of Panama hadn't formed, and therefore oceanic circulation was quite different. And the changes that occurred from that time to the present were relatively slow compared with what we're seeing today. And I think as we look at the warming that's projected for this century, it's important to understand how large scale it is and how quick it is compared with past geological changes. You know, just about the fastest climatic change we know about occurred at the end of the last ice age. So about 20,000 years ago, the planet started to warm as a result of the Milankovitch cycles and so forth. And by 7,000 years later, so by 13,000 odd years ago, conditions had reached pretty much where they are today. And that change involved a warming of the planet of 5 degrees, from 9 degrees to 14 degrees. It involved melting ice from the northern hemisphere that raised sea levels by about 120 metres. So that's a very rapid, a very large-scale rise in sea level occurring over 7,000 years. But if you look at the increase that's projected for the rest of this century, it's about 4 degrees, as we saw, so it's on the same scale as the Ice Age warming, but it's happening over a century rather than 7,000 years. It's happening 20 to 30 times faster, potentially. And it's the speed of something as well as the scale that's important as an impact, as we know in our normal business. I mean, if a slow little bicycle's coming along the road towards you, you might not hurry out of its way, but if a big truck's coming along very fast, you will. So it's scale and speed that are important.
Okay. Sir, down the front here.
Good evening, panel. My name's Luke Matthews. Just with comprehending what you've just said, that's quite a obviously very tricky situation to look at. From what I've been hearing in the newspapers, television, all that sort of stuff, a lot of the reasons, justifications for doing some of the things you're doing are all relatively economy-based. We also have social implications, health implications, justice implications associated with what is going on. It's human life that we're kind of talking about here.
Yeah, it's not just economic.
It's how much energy are you guys putting into those other aspects when we see that there's 120 wells, just 120,000 wells just about to be fracked, which will pretty well wipe out the Artesian Basin on the driest continent on the planet.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, look, I'll just have a very brief go at that. Look, I've just spent a couple of months going up the Great Dividing Range, looking at energy infrastructure and these issues. Just about a week ago I was out at Alpha, the town of Alpha, which is really on the frontier of what's happening there now. I mean, land prices there have gone up 30 times in 1 year. We met someone whose land was valued at $3,000 last year. It's at $90,000 this year. And those sort of changes create incredible social dislocation in a town like that, because you've got the ones who are going to get very rich and those who are going to bear the burden of these increased costs. You know, everything, rates go up and all the rest. So it is a huge issue for the nation, and I think that the social implications and the water implications simply cannot be overlooked as we go forward in this. But you know, one of the things that frightens me personally, and I'm talking about me rather than as the Commission now, is just the speed and scale of these changes that are going on, and the fact that we haven't got our head around the sort of appropriate regulation or the appropriate way of socially dealing with this. It's unprecedented, and I think we need to turn more attention to it, because otherwise we can create a very difficult situation.
I agree with you totally. There are a lot more impacts than on the economy, and a lot more impacts that are important to a lot of people. In my field, I've been studying the impacts on species and ecosystems for 20 years. And, you know, the IPCC in 2007, for example, estimated that about 30% of species could be committed to extinction if we get to 2 to 3 degrees above 1990 levels, and we're, you know, pretty much, you know, well on the way to that now. So, and our ecosystems, of course, are our life support system. You're also very true. It's very true that there'll be real impacts on human health. In a country like Australia, they'll be relatively small compared to other less developed countries. But if we think back to when the Victorian bushfires were on, for example, twice as many people died from heat-related disorders the week before the bushfires as died in the fires. In 2003, 21,000 people in Europe died in the heat wave in France, Portugal and Spain. Yeah, sorry? Yep, absolutely. There'll be all sorts of agricultural impacts. So you're absolutely right. It's about a lot more than the economy. Unfortunately, from my perspective, most people care about the economy and not necessarily about the other things. But everything will be affected.
Okay. And yes, sir, in the blue shirt, second row there. That's you. Yep.
My name's Ken McFadgen. I'm a sawmiller, so I won't be real popular around here. I live at Nebo, fair in the middle of all these mines, where this destruction's bloody going rampant continually. Now, I've been following this debate for a fair while, because it's going to cost me £1 if you bring in a carbon tax. I haven't been convinced by anything I've seen. There's a lot of ifs, buts and maybes, and for every one of you that say it's going this way, there's another one that says it's going the other way. I'd like to be convinced more. What we have to do is start cutting our consumption. We've got a system here where we keep the economy going by making people buy things that they don't want with money that they haven't got. That's how we keep the system going. Then we've got a problem with waste. We've got a problem with the land, as this fella says. We're just raping and pillaging continually. And a fairly good example tonight would be to turn off these. Here we are talking about the climate, and I'll end up with a suntan if this goes any more than bloody hour and a half.
I think, panel, that it is an issue that some people bring up, is that they often hear the opposing view, which gets a lot of airtime. Is that a problem? Sure.
I'm far from convinced that we have or we haven't. Like I say, there's that much confusion out there. And the point is, if we're going to pay, like I say, I own a sawmill, I burn my rubbish. The DOEH want to charge me $380 a year to burn me rubbish. Well, righto, that's fair enough if it's going to help the environment. I asked them what they do about that. Well, they don't do anything. So when they come and gather with a big plastic bag the CO2 that I burn, then I'll pay for it. Now I'm just paying to pollute, and that's what I see this as being. Okay. You'll get it in with the thin end of the wedge, it won't cost much, and the next thing
you're
it'll be like...
talking about the carbon tax there. Can
Yes.
I get the panel to answer some of those questions? Is it about convincing people?
Sure. Let me have a go at the confusion part of your comments there. Look, it's very understandable that the public is confused because, you know, on the one hand, people like us get up and show those graphs that I just showed and say one thing, and then on the other hand, you know, Professor Plimer's written a very best-selling book, and I believe you've even had Bob Carter here a couple of months ago. I think what needs to be said is we need to look at the balance of evidence, okay? It's not the case that there are equal sides to this debate. Let me give you an example. In 2009, there was a very large survey done of climate scientists that publish in peer-reviewed journals, so expert climate scientists. And they were asked, do you believe that human activity is causing the planet to warm? 97.5% of them said yes. So let me give you an analogy. If you turned up to the airport tomorrow and you're about to get on a plane and there were 100 Qantas engineers standing around that plane and 97 of them said, we're fairly certain this plane is going to crash, you probably wouldn't get on the plane because you trust their expertise. Similarly, you don't get a plumber to operate on your brain and you don't get a brain surgeon to fix your taps. It's a question of seeking out expert opinion and letting them get on with it. Now, if you go to every reputable scientific academy in the world, they will say there is no debate about the climate science. The climate science at its most basic is solid. We've understood it for a long time. It's actually quite simple physics. What the Commission is really here about is to try to allay some of the confusion that understandably exists. And I'm sure Tim might add something to that.
Well, can I actually add to the second part of the question, which is why does putting a price on CO2 make any real difference to what people do? Well, there are a couple of important things in life. One of them is very important for me personally, and I'm reassured always that size doesn't matter. However, we do know that price matters. Ask any farmer when they're making a decision about what they're going to plant, how much water they're going to buy, how much fertiliser they're going to apply. Ask any businessman making an investment decision, any supermarket manager, and then any consumer making choices. Price drives behaviour. And the wonder of the carbon price is that it drives behaviour up and down the chain. So it creates the opportunity for more profitable investments, for low carbon emission energy production, for example. It creates the incentive for energy conservation and saving, and it reduces, if you like, overconsumption of energy items, energy-intensive items. So we know prices actually do work, and in Europe, where prices associated with burning product like wood sawdust are high, they take them to the mill, which can actually use them and convert them into energy. And we've seen exactly that happening earlier today at the racecourse generator, which can actually take wood chips and sawdust as well as bagasse.
Can I just make another simple point? Right. I'll just answer that briefly. Look, what the news hasn't carried as much as that initial story about the stolen emails was that there's been 3 commissions of inquiry now, including by the UK government and by the university, into that whole incident, and no misbehaviour has been documented. Nothing would affect the climatic outcomes. So that, in my view, that was it was an attempt to derail the Copenhagen meeting. Someone hacked into the system, stole the emails, released the data just before the meeting to try to dent people's confidence in climate science. But as I said, despite what was it, 1.5 million stolen emails, a very large number, there's been no impropriety been able to be established by any of the Commission's inquiry. But could I just say one thing to your question? Look, you know, under any scheme that's being considered by any government, back to the CPRS, whatever, your sawmill wouldn't be paying a carbon tax. It's only the 1,000 biggest polluters, you know. There's only the 1,000 biggest polluters, so you're not going to be paying it. But what it might do is unlock opportunities for your business to add value from your waste, because that biological waste of yours is very valuable stuff. It could be turned into biochar to enrich soils. It could be used to generate electricity or whatever. And as we put a price on carbon, we'll see those options, I think, becoming more realistic.
There is another question over here. Yes.
My name's Alan Kirby. The one thing that you can count on climate, it always changes. Yeah. Now in 75, they were saying that man was causing cooling. Yeah. That the North and South Pole were cooling.
I think...
That was in 75.
Yeah, I think you probably missed this...
And on the front page of Time, it had, "Are we heading for a mini ice age?"
I think we did cover this a little bit earlier. Do you want to
Happy to just
refresh?
But
yep. Okay.
The other two things are, you've heard of the Roman warming.
We did actually cover this question
Sorry, so
earlier
we have covered this. So
could you tell me how many coal-fired power stations the Romans had?
Look, perhaps because the rest of the audience has heard the answer, could we speak to you later if you hold about, and we'll discuss that individually.
So the lady just that's okay. No, that's fine. The lady just in front of you. Yes.
Hello, I'm Rose Christensen. Just on another level, of our own personal level, what we can do for climate change. There's all of those, all the different things that come out through the Climate Change Commission with what we can do to help with it. I'd like to sort of hear more on that. We're hearing more on what all those other people are going to do, what you're going to make companies do. But all of us on our own level need to be able to look at things that we can do, and what we were talking about just before with our waste, etc. So
you want to know what you can do on a local level, how you can make a difference. Is that?
Yeah, if you can pass on some information like that to us, okay. I'd be happy.
Sure. Look, I'll just briefly outline. I mean, when I realised that this was a major problem, 10 or more years ago now, I decided to just do what I could. And it started off, I remember I was living in Adelaide at the time, and I remember getting up one morning, having a shower. It must have been 30 degrees outside, but I wanted a bit of hot water in my shower, so I turned on the hot. And I thought, this electricity that's heating the water is being generated at Port Augusta, 300 kilometres away, burning really filthy coal up there, with all the transmission losses that came down the line, and the losses to heat the water when the sun could be doing it for me. So I went out and bought a solar hot water system. Not everyone can do that because some people rent, And anyway, since then I've gone through what I can do. I've got a hybrid car. My whole house runs on solar now rather than anything else. I might be a bit of a fanatic, but that's the way it is. But whatever your circumstance, I think the one thing that everyone can do is show some leadership in this area. And even whether it's just going into your workplace and saying, well, can I see the electricity bill? I was at the ABC today here in town, in Mackay, and they were saying, they're trying to do everything they can. And I asked them, well, have you asked the boss to see the electricity bill? And they said, no. It's a really good thing to do. It just makes people aware that there are ways you can save. The same with the local school, workplace, church, sporting group. I think just raise the issue and do something, because if you do something, you're empowering yourself, to do a bit more and take that leadership position. I think change only happens through a few good people taking action. I really do.
Can I just add something? Can I just add something to that? Would it take me a while to get here from Canberra by bike? Can I just add something to that? I think when a lot of people think about how to, and a lot of people are like you thinking, well, what can I do? And the obvious thing to do is to try to save power by being sensible about energy efficiency around your home. Perhaps installing solar hot water and all of that sort of thing. I think the other main thing that people don't think about as much is actual absolute consumption. and where you're consuming things from. You know, so you go to your supermarket, do you buy the mandarins from the USA or the mangoes because they're out of season because they've come from the Philippines? You know, so even just the choices that you make in your supermarket about where you buy your food from makes a difference to the carbon footprint. So, you know, how much you buy. Do you need to buy 10 T-shirts this summer, or would one do? You know, it costs enormous amounts of energy and water to make even the cotton of a T-shirt. So it's not only the daily consumption of energy and water, but it's also the things that you buy. And I think everybody should be more aware of the price, the real price, the environmental price that they're paying for everything we buy.
Can I just give you one example too from the Climate Commission, how we have worked. We realise we burn a lot of jet fuel when we fly from place to place, and we were thinking about offsetting, you know, as a group. But then we thought, no, actually maybe what we should do is take individual responsibility for this. So we've asked the Climate Commission Secretariat to tote up how many miles we fly, give us a cost using the premium offset, the best offset you can get. And then we'll all think about how we might apply that money. So some of us might donate it to a group working on rangelands conservancy. Some might decide to do something else, but something which is offsetting that in a meaningful way to them. And I think, you know, those opportunities are valuable.
Okay, there's a question down here. Yes, sir, what's your question?
My name's Brian Lebrick. I'm a process engineer, and I just wanted to take a point up about the economics, and I've actually posted this question on the website. Two major cogeneration plants at sugar factories and a bioethanol plant have recently gone into receivership. Why would anyone want to make large investments in greenhouse gas abatement projects such as these when government on both state and federal levels lack a coordinated program to advance greenhouse gas abatement projects?
Yes, so thank you for that question. That was coming to that. Jerry, do you want to deal with that one?
I'll pick that one up, having recently retired from a fairly big energy-intensive business. But it's absolutely paramount, I think, that on an issue as big as this, and you've heard the Business Council of Australia ask for it, as a bipartisan approach. And so that there can be sort of continuity of policies to allow people to have the confidence to make the investments. Otherwise, they won't happen. And you know, so that's why I think the business community very widely is saying, for God's sake, you know, let's have a bipartisan approach to this and ensure ourselves that if we put $1 in, we've got a good chance of getting it back, because they're not going to change the rules halfway through. And that's a great example. I think the way the solar panel debate has gone in Australia over the last 10 years, it's been on and off and on and off, hugely on, and then switched off again, and different states doing different things. You know, it's a mishmash, and it does need you know, very clear long-term policies that will allow people to make the investments and make the choices.
And is that part of your role as the Commission?
Well, you know, part of my role I see is
part of the Commission's role,
saying, part of my role on the Commission, I think, is you know, representing my business experience. My business experience says that, you know, the worst thing you can do for investment is to have a huge amount of uncertainty in terms of what the policies are.
And can I just add to that? If the Commission can help build understanding and deal with the questions that some people have in relation to the science, and help people understand the international action and the mechanisms that are available, then we are more likely to get a bipartisan approach, because we're more likely to get to a position where politicians are responding to what the community is saying. And in Europe, you now see both Conservative and Liberal politicians totally bipartisan on looking for an answer to this problem.
Okay. So you have another question? Well, just wait for the microphone. There it is.
It's Jack Long, a retired farmer. Does the panel think that food could be put at risk? I see there's 3 areas that food's being put at risk, and I'd like your views. Farmers, it's never, and I've been across a group of from dairy into small crops to cane, and I'll admit the cane was the most profitable, but there's a big question mark if costs keep getting loaded onto farmers, and because of certain options, particularly in the Central District, there's more and more farmers leaving their properties, run the fence around them and go into the mines. Now, I know that's another aside, but look, farmers will not wear further costs because of increase. Now, I know you have said that farmers will be excluded from costs, but not the inputs, the electricity and the water costs and the fertiliser. You don't see food being at risk? Because a lot of people do.
We'll still be able to provide food.
Well, I think a lot of what happens is that, you know, and I'd regard, you know, I actually come off a farm myself, I actually had a share in the farm until about 3 years ago, actually. Yeah. So, but you know, so I regard, you know, farms as very vital small businesses, but they have a bunch of input costs. They effectively compete against each other to sell their products into the market, and where there's an impost that applies to all, generally, and this applies to all small businesses, generally the cost would get passed through to the end consumer, so the farmer doesn't end up carrying the can for it, except where you're competing against, where you're exporting and competing against others that don't have the cost, and that's when you're in a different issue. But so you know, I think a lot's been made of you know, the extra impost. I think it's been probably over-egged in terms of the scale of it, but ultimately, you know, the consumer will actually pay for the increased cost of food if there is any as a result of it.
Can I add two things to that? Sure. Farmers will also have opportunities, and in the cane sector, we were being told today at the mill that the net opportunities they see from the introduction of a carbon signal in the economy, done as Tim was saying earlier, probably through RECs or some equivalent recognition of biogeneration of fuel and transport fuels. And the other issue is the one that Leslie referred to earlier. Food supplies will be at risk if we are unable to actually deal with climate change effectively, both because of the loss of protein as the CO2 increases, and in Australia's case, a lot of loss of production through our great grain belts. There is, of course, a risk to food supplies if we do the wrong thing on the farming side and subsidise the production of biofuels in the name of energy security, as the Americans have tended to do, and that results in an increase in grain costs that impacts globally.
Sorry, I'll just see if anyone else wants to ask a question and we might come back to you. Oh, okay.
Honestly, the farmers are price takers. There's no way in the world that the consumer pays up. And the biggest wreckers going on right now are Woolworths and Coles. There's 20 farmers, dairy farmers, left the dairy industry in South Queensland. And honestly, there's 54% of farmers, cane farmers, working up at the mines. And they're neglecting farms. So, you know, farmers are definitely, they have to absorb the cost, and they're leaving the farming sector in droves.
Okay. Is there another question? Sir in the red shirt.
Hello, I'm Andrew Wallace. I'm an ex-farmer, gone to the mines to make, can't make a living on the farm, so I've gone to the mines to give my family a bit of a boost up. Like everyone in the world's wanting to do is make the next generation a better generation. And I can see the coal leaving our site, going out to the world, making, bringing the standard of living for other people in the world up higher, and all this consumption of carbon and pollution going to these other people in the world to lift their standard of living. How can we... I don't think it's fair for us to influence other people in the world to stop them from lifting their standard of living, but the coal and the energy that we export is going to do that. So I see that the carbon emissions are going to keep on going while people are wanting to do the only thing that everyone wants to do, that's to bring their families and their lives up to a higher standard than what they are now.
It is a tricky issue, I guess, and it's a fine balance. Who would like to?
Well,
Tim.
Could I just say, I think that's a really valid point of view, and it is absolutely true that as we export energy overseas, people are increasing their standard of living in places like China. But that really is not a good argument for us to continue to pollute willy-nilly. The Chinese already have, as we've heard from Roger, many programs in place to start reducing their emissions intensity, but also to foster the development of clean energy technology. So they're now leading the world in terms of solar energy, although produced in Australia originally, we've exported it, and wind energy. And I think if you look into the future, what we'll see is we're in a transition. You know, we're in a transition where Australian coal is going to be important, as Roger said, probably for the next 25 years. But beyond that, we may be really starting to shift into a much cleaner energy economy. And I don't think that's anything to be scared of, because I mean, I grew up in an Australia that rode on the sheep's back. You know, wool was the resource we all used. You know, and we know that we're resilient. Given enough time, the economy changes, and as we decouple our prosperity and our economic growth from carbon, then you know, in the next 25 years, we'll see that transition take place. So I think you're absolutely right. But I hope my other commissioners agree with me. But
yeah, no, I think that's spot on, because if you look at energy use. Growth in energy use and growth in wealth, they just track each other completely. And the challenge for, I think, the the emerging economies with our assistance is to decouple those, so that growth and wealth, which there's no way that we can deny them growth and prosperity, that we try and decouple that to a far greater extent than we've succeeded in the past from growth in energy use and by definition emissions.
I'd like to take questions from people who haven't asked before. Sir, have you asked a question? Would you like to stand up?
G'day, Mark Faulkner, a small business owner here in Mackay. Question generally, I suppose there's two parts to my question, is we're a small population, 21 million. Our contribution to the CO2 contribution globally is about 2%, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more. I'm not going to question the science. If we actually achieve our targets, what does that contribute globally? Does it actually make any environmental difference? And is this really an economic question about carbon tax and carbon pollution more than an environmental question?
Well, if I could just start with that, there are three reasons why we might want to address our carbon emissions. The first of those is that while we're only, you said 2%, perhaps a little less than that, we're still in the top 20 global emitters. If you look at France's emissions, not per head, in absolute terms, if you look, we're the number one per head, but in absolute terms, we're still in the top 20. We actually emit more than France does as a single country. Now, having said that, so why would we want to take this action? We're exposed to climate change. We want to encourage and move in step with what the rest of the world is doing. The rest of the world is acting. We sometimes get the impression they're doing nothing. That is not true. They are doing things. What we're doing with this 5% target is not leading the world. It is pretty much in the middle of the pack. And thirdly, we need to do this because if the behemoths move very rapidly, our industry needs to have got in place a set of signals that will allow it to restructure efficiently. And finally, I guess it's morally not a bad thing to do.
Okay, last questions. Yes, sir.
Hello, George Christensen, Federal Member for Dawson. I've been listening to a lot of the answers, and there's the word bipartisan and bipartisanship's come up a couple of times, or more than a couple. And even though at the start of this discussion it was said that we weren't here to talk about policy but about climate change itself, You've referred to signals and carbon pricing, which is basically inferencing the carbon tax that the government's proposing. Given that both of the major parties formally recognise climate change as a problem and formally are agreeing to the same reduction in emissions, what is the lack of bipartisanship that you're talking about?
There is the same target, the same commitment to 5%, and that's really important to acknowledge and recognise. The bipartisanship that Jerry and I have emphasised is getting in place a framework that can and will be applied consistently over the long term. In the long term, this has got to look a bit like the way the Reserve Bank treats monetary policy. People need to see it as independent and not subject to annual budgetary whims. I certainly had the pleasure of working for Mr Howard as his chief climate representative during much of that period, and by the end of the Howard period, right from the beginning of the Howard period actually, and by the end, we had developed a fairly comprehensive approach to pricing carbon. Now things have changed a little bit since then, but it's bipartisanship about stable policy in the long term that will provide the signals that enable those investments to be made.
Yeah, and you know, I was the guy who used the word bipartisan. You know, when we talk about carbon price, there's many ways in which you can get to a carbon price: emissions trading scheme, you know, baselining credit, even you know, indirectly through incentives and that sort of thing. So there's many ways you can get to a carbon price. So when we're talking about carbon price, we're not talking about a carbon tax. We're not talking about the current. We're not talking about the current policy that's, you know, being discussed at the moment. You know, a carbon price as an economic signal is what we're talking about, and then you know, for long-term decision making, then you need a stable policy setting, which is best achieved by, you know, both parties agreeing on what is the right mechanism for the country going forward.
Could I just add to that? I mean, there's a really great example in recent history of that, which is the mandated renewable energy target, supported by both major parties, which mandates that by 2020, 20% of Australia's energy will come from renewable sources. And that's the sort of, you know, long-term policy that we need to see certain investment in that area.
Okay, well, I think everybody's had their say at this point. I'll just invite Professor Tim and Flannery. Won't be a moment. Professor Flannery will just wrap up, and then there will be tea and coffee, and you will have an opportunity, if you really want to speak to them in detail, in depth. I'm sure they'd love to have that conversation. But for now, we're restricted by time, so I'd invite Professor Flannery back to the lectern.
Thank you. Look, I will devote a tiny bit of my time to hear you out, sir, because it's your night. It's your people's night.
That everybody talks about. To me, it sounds like a giant Ponzi scheme. Now, I go up to New Guinea, I buy 100 square kilometres off some tribe for $20. I then go and flog it off for 20 million. Somebody else buys that 20 million and flogs it off to somebody else. In other words, they're just creating money out of air.
Well, I get the point that you're making there, and of course any scheme can be run poorly, but as an example of emissions trading that works, Europe is a very good example. You can have a look at the US-German Marshall Fund's assessment of the European emissions trading scheme, and they say the point they make there is that it has delivered what it promised, which is the reduction in emissions on target, and through the market mechanism. So what we see from places like Europe is that these schemes can be run well. Of course, they can be run poorly as well. You've got to have good regulators and you know, good watchdogs and so forth to make them work. And no one's suggesting we want an emissions trading scheme that produces, you know, no result.
At the moment, the way they run things.
Look, the mobbing. Actually, Australia we have got some of the best bureaucrats, and I don't say this lightly, anywhere in the world in terms of understanding this issue. No, we really do. And I know we all say the bureaucrats are full of rubbish and all that. I know some of them personally, and I've had my moments with the bureaucracy as well, but they are very good. Some of the sort of models that we're developing here for implementing it are actually world class. I think Roger would agree. You were in the space, but yeah. Anyway, can I just I'll just finish the questions there, but just to say thank you very, very much for all being here this evening and having this dialogue. It's really important to us. We've learnt a huge amount, I think, today in Mackay, not least thanks to you coming here.
Hello everybody, how are you this evening? Good, welcome to the Commission's community conversation. The aim of the evening, which I'm sure you're aware of, is to begin a conversation. So the Commission is here to listen as well as to share some of their knowledge and experiences. I guess we're going to hear about the science, what it means, what to do about it, and how it relates to you. We'll hear from what the Commissioners have been doing in Mackay and what they've seen, and there will be an opportunity to ask some questions as well. To get started, I'd like to introduce Professor Tim Flannery, the Chief Climate Commissioner. You probably recognise Professor Flannery. He's one of Australia's leading writers on climate change, an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist. Professor Flannery was named Australian of the Year in 2007. He's held various academic positions, including Professor at the University of Adelaide, Director at the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, Principal Research Scientist at the Australian Museum and Visiting Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University in the Department of and Evolutionary Biology. And he's also doing a TV show, so this man can do anything. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Tim Flannery.
Thanks very much, Gillian, and thank you all for being here this evening. I think it's a pretty special opportunity to speak to people such as our climate commissioners here. I think what I'd like to do to begin is just outline a little bit about who the Climate Commission is, the work we're supposed to do, then introduce you a bit more to our commissioners and tell you about what we've been doing today in Mackay. The Climate Commission was established as a result of an election promise by the Gillard government at the last election. It's an independent commission, which means that we don't take direction from the minister, so we're independent in the sense that we are, although we're funded by government, we don't take direction from government on things. And we're charged with really doing three things. We're to lead a discussion on climate science and what the scientists are telling us is happening to our climate. Secondly, to have a dialogue about the state of international negotiations and what's happening in other countries, because Australia is obviously not facing this challenge alone. And thirdly, to lead a discussion about the options, the economic options that are available for a country like Australia as it goes forward in this carbon-constrained world. We're not here to comment on policy, government or opposition, so we're not going to give you our view on a carbon tax or anything else, but we can lead a discussion around the various options.
Level of information to help us all get an idea of where we're going tonight. Professor Leslie Hughes is an expert on the impacts of climate change on species, ecosystems, and she's the head of Department of the Biological Sciences at Macquarie University.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming tonight, and thank you, Gillian. Yes, what I want to do is just sort of set the context of the Q&A that's going to follow, to just show you a few pictures about what's been happening with the climate. I also want to bring it down to a personal level and down to a Mackay-specific level and talk a little bit about what we think some of the impacts of climate change might be for your area here. So let's begin. Put at its most simply, the greenhouse effect, the greenhouse gases are like a blanket wrapped around the Earth. And when solar radiation comes in from the sun, it bounces off the Earth's surface, some of it's absorbed, the rest is reflected back out. And then some of that reflection bounces backwards and forwards under that blanket and through that blanket of greenhouse gases. If we didn't have greenhouse gases, the Earth would be an extremely inhospitable place. We wouldn't be here. It would be about minus 18 degrees. So the greenhouse gases make the Earth about 33 degrees more warm than it would otherwise be. We do need them. a lot of people say, hasn't the climate changed all the time? Isn't what we're seeing now just natural variability? Well, it is the case that climate has changed throughout geological history. And what this graph shows is the relationship, the very, very tight, close relationship with the level of CO2 in the atmosphere and the temperature of the Earth's surface. So this goes back, this graph goes back 400,000 years, and it shows several cycles, ice ages, warming and cooling, with the temperature and CO2 very, very closely aligned with each other. But something different has been happening since the Industrial Revolution, and the little red bit on the end of that graph, if I can make this laser pointer show that bit, that's the increase in greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution. So you can see that we're now right outside that natural variable, that envelope of natural variability. We've been doing something pretty different to the Earth's atmosphere over the last couple of hundred years. And if we just look at that on a more resolved timescale, you can see this is what's been happening to CO2 in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. And you can see it's pretty much been an exponential increase over that time. And along with that, because we understand the relationship between CO2 and temperature, and in fact we've understood that relationship for at least 200 years, this is what's been happening to the temperature in the lower atmosphere going back to 1880. And you can see that it zigzags around from year to year. It's not a smooth curve, but the basic trajectory is upwards. Now, some of you will have heard that 1998 was a particularly warm year, and indeed you can see that on this graph. It's that point there. But since that time, here we are now. 2009, 2010. In fact, the 12 very warmest years ever recorded were June 2009 to May 2010. The 12 warmest months ever recorded. So that's where we are now. So now we're talking about the future, and I want to present you with two different possible futures. One future, a more optimistic future, is shown in those blue lines at the bottom of the bottom graph of temperature. Here we are here. We've got two choices here. Here's the choice that we have to really strongly abate greenhouse gases, really reduce emissions, and if we do that, we might be able to keep future temperature rises to 2 degrees or less. If we don't, if we carry on business as usual, we're looking at the red part of that graph up here. Very broad range. We're not very certain about how hot it will be, but we know it will be a lot hotter. Now, I know some people find it a bit difficult to relate to these sorts of graphs because you think, well, you know, that's a long way in the future, you know, it's not going to affect me. So I want to actually make this a bit personal, if you will forgive my indulgence here. Okay. I was born in the early 1960s, and assuming hopefully that I'll live till I'm about 85, I've put my lifespan in there and I've lined it up with the average temperature increase that I will experience over my lifespan, so it's there. I've got two teenage kids born in the 90s, mid-90s, so assuming they live till they're about 85, I've put their lifespan in there, also lined up along the average temperature at which they will experience over that time. And I don't have grandchildren yet, but if I do have a couple of grandkids, and let's assuming my kids have them when they're about 30 and they live till they're about 85, that's their lifespan. So what I want to just point out to you that, for example, in my grandkids' lifespan, if they live beyond
that are available to us. Today we've spent meeting with community leaders and looking at some of your industries here in Mackay. We went out to the Racecourse Sugar refinery earlier on today, which was a very, very interesting experience for us. We had a look at the plant there which is being built that in a couple of years' time will be providing a third of Mackay's electricity from renewable sources, which I was really surprised at. That, as a community, that puts you in the lead, really, in terms of developing renewable energy sources, and I think will give you in future a very profitable new industry in this part of the world. So that was very encouraging for us. We met after that with a number of leaders. We met with your mayor, with business leaders from the mining industry and mining-related industry, from the sugar industry, and from local council, and had a broad-ranging discussion on the issues that I mentioned the Commission's charged with discussing. So that was, I think, a very, very cordial and very good meeting for us. We learnt a lot. We hope that the people we met with learnt something as well. So we're very pleased to be here this evening, having had that insight into the community here and the sort of challenges you face. I just want to talk briefly about our climate commissioners here, because we have got some very, very special people who I think can give you the benefit of their very long and extensive engagement with climate issues. Roger Beale over here is an economist working with PwC, but among the many things he's done was help negotiate the Kyoto Protocol. He currently advises Premier Hu Jintao of China on clean energy and environmental policy. So he's got an excellent overview of not just economic matters, but the overall negotiations, international negotiations. He also knows more than anyone that I know about every individual business around Australia. He seems to have visited every factory in the country, so he's pretty full bottle on all of that as well. Leslie Hughes, Professor Leslie Hughes from Macquarie University, who's a climate scientist with expertise in climate adaptation and the impacts of changing climate on biodiversity. And Leslie will give a presentation at the beginning here just to outline what we know about climate science and where we're going. And Jerry Houston, who's the ex-CEO of BP Australasia. So from a business perspective and someone who's dealt with the practicalities of the climate challenge in a carbon-intensive industry, he's got a lot of very important things, I think, to say. So, so with that, I think I will sit down and hand over back to our moderator.
Thank you. Now I will invite Leslie to come up, and she's going to she's giving a short presentation. So there's a couple of slides, and it's just it's not a lecture. It's just a basic.
The year 2100, this is the potential range of temperatures that they might experience. So I just wanted to do that to kind of bring it home to you that this is about us, it's about our children, and it's about our grandchildren. They will be affected. Okay, well, let's talk about Mackay. Over the past decade, the average annual temperature in Mackay has increased about 0.3 of a degree. So your average annual temperature used to be 22.7 and it's now 23 degrees. By 2070, global climate models indicate that temperatures might increase a further 1.6 to 3 degrees, depending on the scenario that's used. The number of days above 35 is currently 1 a year. That might increase, according to the models, to about 12 a year by 2070. And if we think about rainfall, the average rainfall in this region's declined about 14% over that past decade. Projecting rainfall in the future is really hard, but the best estimate is for potentially an ongoing decline by 2070, maybe about another 5 to 10% decline. Sea levels have been going up in Queensland, North Queensland, about 3.3 millimetres a year, and that's around about the global average. Last year, the government released an impacts report on looking at coastal vulnerability of coastal infrastructure all around Australia. Mackay came out as the second most vulnerable region in Queensland when you look at the potential for residential buildings to be inundated by a sea level rise of about 1 metre. So second highest risk. We're looking at potentially much more extreme events, both in frequency and in intensity. So while we can't attribute any particular extreme event like this flood back in February 2008 to climate change, what we're looking at is potentially an increase in the frequency and intensity. And in tropical cyclones, the models are indicating that there may only be a small increase in frequency, but potentially quite a substantial increase in the intensity of cyclones, with by 2070 about 140% increased probability of category 3 to 5 cyclones. And I'm sure that some of you have lived through those sorts of fairly scary events. The Great Barrier Reef, which Queensland relies on for a lot of its tourism income, is actually subject to really 4 different threats.